Okay, good evening. If you guys can find a seat, I would like to welcome you all to the School of Visual Arts and to this Department of Design Research, Writing and Criticism. And I'm the founder of the program and the chair, and it's a wonderful one-year intensive exploration of design research, which is coming to an exciting conclusion at the moment for this year's students who are just about to finish their thesis research. So if you're interested, I would invite you to stay for the drinks after the lecture, chat to the students, check us out online or via Twitter. And I also wanted to mention an exhibition that the thing isn't working, but that's okay. Which we're putting together, featuring the design research process. So putting the research that often gets kind of hidden away as the sort of afterthought or backstory of thesis work, putting that front and center. Oh, there we go. Just took its time. So that's why it's called Exploding Footnotes. We're bringing the footnote material to the fore. So save the date for that on Wednesday, May 13th. Another thing to mark your calendar for is our summer intensive, a 2-week immersion into design, writing, and research, which runs from June 1st to 12th. And we still have spaces for a few more for that. So if you're interested, sign up online. Okay, so we've got a couple more lectures left in our spring lecture series. It's been really, really fun so far, and if there are particular lectures you've missed you'd like to catch up on, we video them, and most of them are available on our website. And now it's my very pleasurable even, duty to introduce tonight's speaker. Francesca Granata is a fashion historian, theorist, and curator. She's assistant professor of fashion studies at Parsons, the New School, and that lives within the School of Art and Design, History and Theory. And she also holds a PhD from St. Martin's, Central St. Martin's in London. Francesca has co-authored the book Bernard Wilhelm and Jutta Kraus, which was published by NAI in 2010, and has contributed several articles to Fashion Theory, the Journal of Design History, and Form magazine. And her monograph, titled, it's a wonderful title, Experimental Fashion, Performance Art, Carnival, and the Grotesque Body. Thesis students take note. That's a good one. Is forthcoming from IB Taurus later this year, or it was next year. Okay. She is founder and editor of the non-profit journal Fashion Projects, which she began back in 2004, hoping to create a forum for more meaningful critical discourse around fashion, and specifically experimental fashion. The most recent issue, you can see on the right there, tackled a subject very close to our hearts here in the program, that of fashion criticism, and also used a method that we particularly value, the interview. The issue is comprised of interviews with leading critics in the US and beyond, including W editor Stefano Tonci, International Herald Tribune critic Susie Menkes, The New Yorker's Judith Thurman, New York Times writer Guy Trebay, and Robin Given, who was the first fashion critic to receive a Pulitzer Prize and is an inspiration for some of our projects here in the program. So using this issue of Fashion Projects as a springboard and source material, Francesca's talk this evening will address the history and present state of fashion criticism. And as you can imagine, I'm very much looking forward to the talk and to the Q&A as an opportunity to discuss the composition and complexion of fashion criticism with a true expert. I think it will be really interesting to learn more about the similarities that might exist between fashion criticism and its neighboring genres in art and film and design criticism, as well as its idiosyncrasies, its very peculiar qualities. I expect we might also explore what the current shifts in the media landscape take away from fashion criticism and what they might offer, as well as probing its points of intersection and or disconnect with the industry and fashion design education. And I should point out we have a world-class expert on this subject sitting right here. One of our MA students, Brittany, is studying fashion design education. and we will be involving her in the Q&A for sure. Sorry, Brittany, but you know. As you can see, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we better get on with it. Please welcome to the podium Francesca Granata.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for coming on such a nice evening. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Can you hear me? Should I? I'm just going to go closer to the mic. Is this good?
Is that okay?
Yeah.
If you put it down a bit.
Okay. Sounds good. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of a background on fashion projects and my interest in fashion more generally. I came to write about fashion from my interest really in performance, body, and gender studies. And in fact, my primary areas of research is the way fashion allows for negotiation of a series of bodily, gender, and social norms. Fashion Projects, the publication I founded in 2005, and currently still I'm the main editor, was and is, from the very beginning, a kind of side project. It worked as a counter to my academic work, a sketchbook of sort. And also the format, as it has been mentioned, interview-based, was purposely not allowing for heavily footnoted academic text. And it was, although we know Q&A only magazine, the most famous one is, of course, Interview, started by Andy Warhol. I was inspired by Index magazine, a really great magazine that was around in the 90s and early O's on a series of cultural practices. And it was exclusive Q&As. So I started Fashion Projects at a time when I was feeling a bit stuck, actually, and rather uncertain as to what to do next. I'd finished a master's in cinema studies at NYU, but I knew I didn't care about film enough to want to do a PhD in it. And then I ended up working on an exhibition in Italian fashion with Valerie Steele, or rather for Valerie Steele, at the museum at FIT, and so became familiar with fashion as a field of inquiry. However, I started Fashion Projects really in the spirit of independent press and zines at the suggestion of my partner as a way to kind of get unstuck in my, I guess, creative work or research, who was working on his own publication, The Lowbrow Reader, on lowbrow comedy. So that's really how it came about. It really didn't come about out of my academic work. It started with the mission to highlight, or rather mission statements, because I still had this academic in me that wanted to do a mission statement from the very beginning. So about highlighting the importance of fashion and textile design within current critical discourses, through interview with a range of artists, designers, writers, and curators, as well as through other planned projects and exhibition. It is meant to foster a dialogue between theory and practice across disciplines. Eventually, we acquired a nonprofit status through NYFA, New York Foundation for the Arts, and received a small grant from the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. Although, to be honest, I never really did extensive fundraising, as I was quite happy with just recoup the cost of printing through sales of the magazine. And we sell it through a distributor that does magazine distribution, as well as online through our site, fashionprojects.org. So far, we have developed 4 print issues. So we do it kind of whenever we feel like it. It doesn't really follow a magazine model in that sense, or even a journal, really, while keeping a lively online presence. All of our print issues are themed. Our first covered the luxury industry, forgery, appropriations, and notions of authenticity. Our second revolved around fashion collectives and collaborative projects. Our third issue on fashion and memory was instead inspired by this touching essay by Peter Celebras called Worn Words. Peter Celebras is an English scholar, and it was really instead about his ability to remember his late colleague, Alon White, only through the clothes Alon wore. So this issue looked at fashion as a kind of material memory, and also, to some extent, how that can be related to ideas of sustainability. And here are some of the spreads and articles from this issue. This is an interview with Shelley Fox, who is a British designer, now New York-based, who did a lot of work with textiles. Here is an interview with Judith Clark, a British-based fashion curator, who is rather well known, at least in fashion curatorial circle. This is an exhibition she did on Anna Piaggi, the Italian fashion critic and fashion journalist at the V&A. This is some other work. Oh, and this is a great interview with Tanya Marcuse, the fine art photographer, who at the time for this project took photographs of undergarments and armors in museum collections. Oh, and this is perhaps one of my favorite pieces we ever did. It's by Sarah Scaturo, was then the conservator at the Cooper Hewitt, and Keith Price was the photographer for it. And it was kind of this idea of writing an essay about her relation to the clothes that she was the caretaker of. So in textile, it's not just a clothes collection, a fashion collection, the Cooper Hewitt. And here are some of the photographs from that piece. So what I found interesting, and all this work went beyond before I got my job at Parsons, so I was doing my PhD and doing this kind of thing on the side. What I liked also about Fashion Project, it gave me the ability to do some side projects with different institutions. So for instance, we did, in connection to this issue, a film screening of short films that had to do with the topic of fashion memory, and we did that with Parson. And those are some stills from a Boudica film, short film that we showed. Erwin Olaf was another one of the people whose short films we showed. He's best known, of course, as a photographer. And another project that came out of these issues and the investigation of fashion memory was an exhibition I did with, again, Scaturo on sustainable fashion. And in this case, we partnered with Pratt. So it was kind of nice at the time to be such a freelancer. I got to do project with different kind of institution, all related in some way to fashion projects. So. What I enjoy most about working on Fashion Project is, in fact, the interaction with the contributors and also the people that we interviewed. And that's why I wanted it to be a Q&A, because I wanted this kind of dialogue. I wanted to meet the people. I mean, of course, I don't meet all of them. And the people that came to us eventually in an up and sense way, and they contribute. Some of them are here. Lucy's here. Lucy Collins, are people that work perhaps more on the cultural side of fashion and in the industry. So people that work in museums, journalists, and academics. And this same impetus in wanting to start Fashion Project led me to its fourth issue on fashion criticism. Some of the questions I was trying to answer with this issue were, why has fashion criticism remained understudied and undervalued? What has been its historical development vis-a-vis other fields of criticism? And whether its delay of legitimization is tied to its gender specificity, so that it was in fact at the beginning wrote by and for women. So these issues, again, featured a series of interviews with critics from the United States and beyond. Our subjects included the fabulous and the brainy, such as Judith Thurman, a wonderful writer for The New Yorker, who writes about fashion. Guy Trebay, who is a cultural critic for the Times, also writes primarily for the style section. And he has a kind of downtown cultural icon, Lynn Yeager, best known for her work at The Voice and now freelancing for places including Vogue. And of course, Robin Given, who was the first to get the Pulitzer Prize, the first fashion critic. We also covered Susie Menkes and Mariuccia Casadio, who is an Italian-based critic, and she had the very unique position to be both an art and fashion critic for Vogue Italia, which is, I think, is a specifically Italian thing to cross over. It's much less likely that you would have a position like this in the States. And then, of course, Stefano Tonchi is best known as an editor here. He edited L'Uomo Vogue, Self, started T Magazine, and now edited W. But he also started in the 80s by doing his own publication called West Stuff in Florence. No, actually. Yeah, in Florence, and then he moved to Milan. And then we also had an essay on Bill Cunningham. We never got to interview him, unfortunately. So all of them discuss their work chronicling a billion-dollar industry. And we were shocked to discover that at the time it was published, the issue was the first sustained investigation of its kind. So film criticism, as it's Pauline Kael's and Andrew Sarris's, and music criticism, it's Robert Christgau, and Guillermo Marcus's. Yet fashion remains, in the words of one of the critics we interviewed, culturally beneath regard. One of the other things that's trying to unpack with the issue, and I'm still very interested in it, is the fact that is the relation between fashion criticism and academic writing, because I believe that criticism often provides the first line of scholarship on a topic. And according to me, this is similar to what happened with film criticism if we think of figures like Siegfried Kracauer or the work that went on in Cachet du Cinéma starting from the 1950s, and which really heralded auteur theory. So although the issue was really interviews with working journalists, I've since started considering the relation between the advent of fashion studies as a developing field of academic and fashion writing outside the academy. Interestingly, one of the founding texts of the field, fashion studies, Adorning Dreams, Fashion and Modernity, was written in 1985 by Elizabeth Wilson, whose work spanned fiction and nonfiction writing, in addition to her more straightforward academic text. And notably, she wrote quite a bit for The Guardian, as well as a magazine like The New Statesman in Britain in the 80s as well as 90s. And I should add that my research in the field of fashion criticism is still in process. I'm still completing my historical research. And it's also limited in scope to English language, and in particular British and American-based general interest magazines and newspapers. As I really want to analyze fashion criticism comparatively to other form of culture criticism. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not looking, for the most part, at work published within the fashion glosses. And a book I am currently working on is an anthology of fashion criticism from 1980s to the present. So what I found out so far through my interviews, as well as through the historical research, that this process of legitimization of fashion criticism happened later than other fields of popular culture criticism, which went through this process really in the 1960s and 1970s, when barriers between high and low culture began to be taken down. And so this process is, of course, complicated by the fact that it's going on at the same time that changes in journalism is rapidly undergoing. And yet, fashion criticism has its own distinctive histories. For instance, fashion was covered by The New Yorker almost from its inception in 1925 by Louise Long, who, upon her death in 1974, was credited by William Shawn, then the magazine's totemic editor, with inventing the field. She was one of the New Yorker original staff members, and this is a column, was called On and Off the Avenue. This is I just got it from the New Yorker archives. It's a 1929 issue. So she was one of the New Yorker original staff member and started working. She started out by writing a column on nightlife, actually, and city life. So it's kind of similar to, for instance, how Guy Trebay came to fashion by writing about city life. He famously wrote about the Bronx. So it was a completely different beat before he went to fashion, but he felt like it was this idea of urban anthropology that he was covering. According to Sean, Louise Long was, and here I'm quoting it, the first American fashion critic to approach fashion as an art and criticize women's clothes with independence, humor, and literally style. Interestingly, she started writing about fashion at a time in which the New Yorker did not allow for photograph. As you can see, it was, when it came to illustration of the article, it had to be all illustrated, thus making her task undoubtedly more difficult. After Long, Kennedy Frazier took the helm, and later Ollie Bruback, until Judith Thurman. And an interesting precursor to Long's witty writing of fashion can be found in a much lesser-known publication, a short-lived New York-based Little from 1915, informed by Dada and Surrealism, titled Rogue, as a pun, of course, on Vogue, which ran this really funny regular column titled Philosophical Fashion by Dame Rogue, who was Linda Norton. So this is the cover where all at the same pattern, and that's the Philosophical Fashion column. However, writing on fashion appeared regularly in newspapers, starting in the late 19th century, when Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher of the New York World, is credited with, if not the development, at least the popularization of the women's section of newspapers. A placement that certainly contributed to the field's delay in legitimization. Also known as women's pages, these sections were often the only places where women journalists would be allowed to write extensively and establish careers, and were central to the division between soft and hard news. By the middle of the 20th century, they were known and largely dismissed as the epitome of soft news, covering the 4 Fs: food, fashion, family, and furnishings. And I don't know if you can see, you can't quite read, but I pulled one from the 20s and one from the 50s, and you can see fashion is in the mix of, articles such as Swordfish now in good supply, or so it's very, that was kind of the tone, and these are both from the Times. What happened with the women pages is that starting in the late 60s and through the early 70s, they were transformed into what we know today as the style sections, and as a response to societal change in gender roles. So in 1969, the Washington Post transformed its section for and about women into the style section. The Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune followed in 1970 and 1971, while the New York Times didn't really begin its style section until 1978, so it's quite late in the game. Also notably, the use of byline for fashion in newspapers started much later than other field of criticism. It wasn't until the 50s with Carrie Donovan that we start seeing a byline for fashion writing. But the title fashion critic was not officially used as a job title until 1994, when the New York Times coined it for Amy Spindler. Is anybody familiar with Amy Spindler? You are? Okay. So Spindler worked at a time, primarily in the 90s, when fashion itself came to be seen as having a theoretical, critical edge. So it is around this time that the term deconstruction fashion came to be used in the English language. It was coined by Bill Cunningham in the pages of Details magazine of September 1989 to describe Margiela's collection of the same year. Spindler was influential in defining this movement in the pages of the Times, and here I included a few very important articles that defined the construction fashion for the English-based press, called Coming Apart. It was longer than this. I just included the first page. And another, I think, very important article she wrote was about the heroin chic in the wake of the death of Sorrenti, not Mario Sorrenti's brother. I don't remember his first name, sorry. So writing about deconstruction, she described it as, quote, a backlash against established 80s excess, an asbestos soothe against the bonfire of the vanities. And so she had this really brilliant way to write. Unfortunately, she died quite young, so she couldn't continue the work at the Times for too long. But it's interesting, again, to observe a parallel within film criticism. As film itself became more critical in the 1970s with the breakdown of the studio system and directors became very kind of well-known independent director, its intended form of criticism gained legitimacy. And this is what happened, I believe, in fashion in the 90s. So as fashion itself became more critical and quote-unquote intellectual, so fashion criticism also gained legitimacy. However, as mentioned, the Pulitzer Prize board did not bestow the award in criticism to a fashion writer until 2006, when it was given to Robin Given, then at the Washington Post. The jury praised Given for, again, this is a quote, her witty, closely observed essays that transform fashion criticism into cultural criticism. A statement that implies, I believe, although certainly unwittingly, that fashion and its attended critical studies normally resides outside of culture. So she really was able to bring it into culture where it otherwise wasn't into culture. And the reason for this delay in recognition, again, are multiple. Perhaps, as we've seen so far, the most obvious ones is the gender dynamic of the field, its association with women and the feminine, which have been in turn historically associated with consumption, certainly contributed to its lack of status. As Given herself pointed out in the interview in Fashion Project, the fashion industry is the victim of terrible sexism, which I think this is important to make a point of, comes from both men and women. New Yorker writer Judith Thurmans also understands the resistance to fashion as tied to its historical categorization as a soft subject, a woman's subject. However, she claims that there might be something specifically American about it, which is tied to the country's puritanical tradition, its relation to sexuality, and most specifically, female sexuality, contributing, according to Judith Thurman, to fashion's marginalization within the cultural landscape. Finally, the New York Times culture critic Guy Trebay adds that, and these are his words, there is something slightly perverse and masochistic to applying yourself to fashion, at least within the cultural industry. And yet he adds that things have changed throughout his career. And here I'm going to read a quote from the magazine by Guy Trebay. So the culture changed. I think people are interested in fashion. I was a contract writer at The New Yorker for quite a long time. And I wrote for lots and lots of magazines. You never saw anyone in those mainstreamy magazines writing about fashion. I mean, Kennedy Fraser and Ollie Brubeck at The New Yorker, but they didn't have a style issue then. It wasn't what serious people, that is, people with testicles, do, end quote. So, and he gave his entire Q&A was highly quotable. I think it was my favorite in the piece, in the issue. This attitude was further complicated, I believe, by feminism's conflicted relation to fashion. An anti-fashion sentiment can be traced to early feminists in England and North America. And addressing the complexities of feminist movements' relation to fashion, Elizabeth Wilson noted in the 1980s how a number of feminists throughout the 70s often dismissed fashion as representing women's false consciousness, right? And Also, the 1970s leftist intellectual establishment relation to Marxist thought, particularly in England, certainly further complicated this relation. However, I noticed in my research that this did not prevent some of the most inspiring fashion criticism of the 1980s from developing within these very circles. It is in the pages of the New Statesman that Wilson published her journalistic writing on fashion, while Angela Carter, I don't know if is anybody familiar with Angela Carter? Okay, who is really most known as a fiction writer, wrote beautifully about, and she's certainly a feminist writer, wrote beautifully about fashion for the New Society in the period. In fact, she wrote an article about makeup titled The Wound in the Face. And on the other side of the Atlantic, people like Anna Hollander wrote about fashion during the same period for the New Republic and the New York Review of Books. And those are certainly the kind of publication where you see a crossover between academia and journalism. In fact, I would say that for the most part, academics and journalists work within the pages of this publication. So in fact, the 80s, I think, is where we saw a parallel boom of fashion writing within the academy and criticism. So this kind of boom happened at the same time. And it was around this time that a number of academic texts on the subject were first published, as with Wilson one, Adorning Dreams, Karen Evans, Women in Fashion, Valerie Steele, Fashion and Eroticism, and so on. This has been, of course, amply theorized, at least when it comes to academia, in relation to postmodernism, its attendant fragmentation of identities and stable historical narratives, and the breakdown of categories of high and low culture. And despite its original disadvantage, fashion is undoubtedly gaining ground as a subject of critical analysis and criticism, thanks to its centrality to a process of identity formation and to a culture that is becoming increasingly visual in kind. Clothing, as the theorist Kaya Silverman writes, is a necessary condition of subjectivity, or as Wilson adds, clothes socialize our bodies, dress is the cultural metaphor of the body. For the body, it is the material with which we write or draw a representation of the body into our cultural context. Or as Thurman more succinctly in journalistic fashion puts it, fashion is our interface with the world. In fact, fashion criticism is bucking, for the most part, the downsizing trend in journalism. The amount of serious writing about fashion has increased in newspapers, like the New York Times, as opposed to decreasing. Now it has 2 weekly dedicated style section, the Thursday and the Sunday one, in addition to T Magazine and its accompanying blog. And I don't know if anybody has noticed, they just launched the monthly men's style section, it's called? Okay, so it's kind of reversed. It went full circle from women's page to men's style section. While the New Yorker, of course, has the yearly special issue on style. Moreover, the press that covers fashion has increased with the advent of publication dedicated exclusively to fashion, which are not the glosses of error. There is small publication like Bestoy, based in Paris, Address, and of course, Fashion Project. And finally, thanks to its highly visual nature, fashion criticism, I believe, is well poised to embrace new multimedia modes of journalism, which integrate visual and text. One could even go in so far to argue that fashion magazines, thanks to their highly visual nature, pioneered these modes of journalism, although obviously without having access to current technological platforms. Among my favorite multimedia fashion publication is certainly Show Studios. This is an article we did with Penny Martin. We interviewed her, I believe it was 2007 when she was the editor of Show Studio. And Show Studio famously pioneered the short fashion film. It did so prior to the widespread of broadband. So its early fashion films had to work with considerable limitations. They're short, low-res, and were taken from mobile cameras. At that time, mobile cameras were very kind of, they couldn't really give you the quality of image that and certainly not a video that they gave us now. And in my mind, that was kind of the most exciting moment of Show Studio, when they had to work with these limitations. Obviously, as broadband became widespread, then they could do much more high-res videos. And this is just images from, these are not from Show Studio, this is from fashion projects from the interview. Another platform that I think does fashion criticism, if we can call it so, quite well is this magazine. Actually, one of my ex-student, Rachel, pointed out to me, this is a piece they did called Shoulder Dysmorphia. It's really kind of making a pun on what would happen if your body had to be cosmetically altered to fit within certain kind of season silhouettes. And perhaps a less expected example of multimedia journalism is provided by Bill Cunningham. His column is a very whimsical column on the street that I'm sure we all know, a collage of street fashion photographs loosely arranged about a theme, which comes to life in video form on the Times website, narrated in this kind of intimate and off-the-cuff manner by Cunningham himself. This format, I believe, was anticipated by Bill Cunningham's work for the pages of Details in the 80s. And Details at the time was really not the same as it is now. It was not owned by Condé Nast. It was kind of an avant-garde independent fashion magazine, so it was quite different. It was then bought by Condé Nast. That completely changed. So twice a year, Cunningham went all over Europe to do collection, to look at the collection, and he came back and wrote critical pieces about it. But interesting, he took over the entire magazine for these 2 issues a year, and he both did the photographs and the copy, which is obviously quite unusual, and he often laid out or helped laying out the issue himself. So here are some of the 1980s reporting that he did in Details. And here is him in the early 90s, still in Details. He was one of the first to really write about deconstruction in an interesting way, together with Spindler in the English-based press. So to conclude, this growing interest in fashion is reflected not only in greater media coverage, but in fashion legitimization as an academic subject across universities in the US and international. Thus, as is often the case, advances in criticism foreshadow advances in the academy. Fashion is central to debates surrounding gender, race, body, and appearances. And as fixed identities have come into question and identities have come to be understood as increasingly performative, the centrality of fashion and its attendant criticism solidifies. Due to its large relevance in today's increasingly visual culture, fashion is central to politics of representation. As Given points out, fashion is an industry that helps us define what is beautiful in the context of a society that places an incredible value on beauty, thus, quote, helping us decide how much we value different groups of people, undoubtedly something worth engaging in critical debates about. So it is time to reflect on our cultural prejudices and untie the historically bound Gordian knot of fashion, femininity, and consumption that has allowed fashion and its intended forms of study to be somewhat dismissed. Fashion criticism is in fact entrusted with covering a central and multifaceted area of culture, one that has to be taken seriously and on par with other forms of cultural criticism. Thank you. All right, yeah.
Thank you very much. Will you join me for some questions over here? Come and take a seat. That was great.
I have some.
Great, yeah, well, we
I'll
can...
just put them here. Maybe we can give it to.
Yeah, definitely, when we go for the drinks afterwards. Well, thank you so much for that sort of incredible survey of your research. It's completely fascinating. So I have a few questions, and then, like I said, we'll bring in some of the students and then members of the audience to ask some questions. I think one thing I'd really, and so I'm not sure if you know, but I've actually been studying the history of design criticism more generally.
Yes.
You know, industrial design criticism. So I'm very interested in the methods you've been using and sort of what you've been doing here. So I wonder if we could start by trying to establish if it's important at all, and if so, how you would draw a distinction between design or fashion journalism and fashion criticism.
Yeah.
So
the way I'm going about it is like not having. I mean, in my mind, I do have a working definition, but I feel like I'm going to do the historical research and then come to a definition. And I also, the parameter of this particular work, I am not looking, and it has to kind of be published in a forum that's journalistic for me to study. So obviously, I'm not looking at academic books, which could follow under fashion criticism. One of the immediate way I think it's journalism of a certain caliber. It has a point of view, and also there's with fashion, you know, you have to be, or any kind of journalism. I think I'm staying away from the glosses because their relation to advertising is being historically very different than general interest magazine and newspapers. So, but I don't have a definition yet. I'm hoping that after I do my historical research, the definition will kind of appear.
Okay, sounds good. But just to follow up on that idea of the relationship to advertising, I mean, you mentioned when you talked about the recent growth of fashion criticism, you brought up things like T magazine and so forth. And I think some of us feel that, you know, the reason that they're expanding and doing so well is they're the ones pulling in the advertising, right, for that publication. But do you see the work? Do you still then see the work that's going on there contributing meaningfully to fashion criticism?
I would say some of it does. Obviously, T magazine has different policies than the Times itself. But you know, obviously, if you work at the Times, you can get free clothes. There is very clear barrier whether you work in the style section or not. So they still have to go by this kind of journalistic ethos. Not all that's written in the style section fall within fashion criticism, but certain the work of Vanessa Friedman does. I think Guy Trebay writes beautifully for the style section. And there are others. Of course, there is also more straightforward consumer reporting that you can find also in, I don't know, in the sports, not the sports section, I'm sorry, I mean to say the car section. So, but I think there is also this idea that fashion is related to consumption in a way that other other design fields are not as related to consumption, whereas my kind of argument that they all are related to consumption, but fashion is more devalued for being related to consumption because of its connection with the feminine. I think there is a kind of, that's where it becomes delegitimized. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, definitely historically. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I wonder if we could switch to talk about the technique of interview, which plays such a role in the magazine. And I wonder, do you have a particular approach to interviewing that you may have told your authors to adopt, or that you adopted yourself, or one that emerged in the process?
I am not a trained journalist by any means. Um, my husband is, and so he kind of gave me a. We do, at least we all do transcriptions, I think. So we don't take notes, and so he gave me like a tape recorder and said, "You go and do it." And it's kind of interesting. The first few times I was very nervous, and now I really look forward to it. But my technique, I kind of, I prepare a lot. I'm the kind of person that asks prepared questions, but then I just kind of go in and go with the flow. I think the fact that Q&As can be very, very stressful if you had to publish it the next week for a magazine, because what if the person gives you really bad answers? But the fact that, it's completely something, okay, if a Q&A goes badly, I don't have to run it. So I have much less stress. And also, there was something else I wanted to say about the Q&A format. I think it just allows for more dialogue to go on.
Well, come back.
Yeah, sure.
We definitely enjoy it as a way of reporting and researching. Before we turn over to students, could you just let me know how important the word fashion is to all of this? I mean, you mentioned that particular example where Robin Givhan's work was being kind of taken seriously because it became cultural criticism, which I thought was very interesting. Does it need to be called fashion criticism anymore? Would it be more usefully termed, I mean, you talked about urban anthropology, which I thought was very interesting, or garments, clothing, identity,
Right.
etc. Or is there something actually important about holding on to the word fashion in this?
Sorry, I just remember, I really like Q&A in person. I hate them over the phone, and email is like really not my favorite. But so why the word fashion? Yeah, I feel like obviously to me as a scholar, it's important. It defines a set of practices that have to do also with the industry. It have to do with a level of change. So clothing, although I would put anything in fashion, certainly clothing in my mind is a bigger category. It involves, if you look at uniform, perhaps you think of them as clothing as opposed to fashion, although if you look at them historically, they still somewhat follow the fashion of the times insofar that it's just a much slower tempo of change than women's wear, for instance. So it is important to me, but I'm kind of curious to see if people find it. Urban anthropology is something that Guy Trebay uses to describe his work. And it's funny because he started out doing that kind of work really early and then applying it to fashion. Now I feel like it's with the street style blog, it's something that's been popularized much more than when he came up with that kind of technique.
But it's interesting that Robin Givhan's work, for example, I mean, she rarely is dealing with fashion per se. She's talking about, in the instances I find particularly inspiring, she's talking about the style decisions or the way in which, politicians wear chinos in order to, convey certain signals to their constituents and so forth.
Yeah, and it's funny because she said, I wanted to do fashion at the Post because it was a city where nobody seemed to care about fashion. It's a thing not to care about fashion, because I don't know if you saw Obama, for instance, or politicians, they never wear nice men's shoes. They always wear these combination shoes.
Combination shoes?
Yeah, the one that's like kind of like half sneaker, half dress shoes, which I don't like. And I was like, why wouldn't Obama? I was asking Jay would wear dress shoes. That looks awful to me. And is it comfort? And I was like, well, no, because I think it has to be one of the people. So you can't be wearing Milanese, built, nice men's brogue.
Doesn't seem to have a problem with
With the combination shoes?
That, but also not being one of the
Right.
people in her
And of course, she's, she has a different role. But yeah, so I think she was saying that this kind of anti-fashion was also part of they're still obsessed with fashion, but they have to respond in a way they have to be like maybe 5-10 years below the curve, not to look too fashion forward or to, wear something that's relatable. So there's it's certainly implicated there, but yeah,
Well, it's interesting there's that much subtlety and consciousness around it, and that she's picking up on that.
Yeah, but I think that's why perhaps their work is so compelling, because it's looking at a city that's not known as a fashion city, although according to her, as a huge investment in image and style and fashion, because of it's a kind of still image-based thing.
Okay, cool. Well, now I'd like to, Brittany.
Yes, I have a few questions. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you were talking about alternative methods of fashion criticism. You were talking about the show dysmorphia and fashion film. And it made me think about how manifestos seem to be on the rise. Like the Edinburgh just published the anti-fashion
Oh, yeah.
manifesto, and then Manifesto, which has their manifesto in the beginning of each issue. So I was
Vesto,
wondering-
you mean? No.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the manifesto as a platform for fashion criticism.
Huh. I don't have much to say about manifestos for fashion criticism, but it's definitely different, because when I think of manifesto, I certainly do not think about fashion. Can you perhaps tell me a little bit more of what you think? Because also, I would love to hear your comments, because this is very much a work in process, not finished research.
Well, it just seems like the manifesto is a more extreme version of fashion criticism. And it seems to be a specific thing. I'm not sure how I would.
If to be or maybe you want to just talk about some of the other alternative formats that you're including. I thought that those Bill Cunningham kind of collage juxtapositions of imagery really, really interesting. I couldn't tell just from that glance, but was he trying to make a critical point through that kind of imagery?
It kind of, if I had to look at it through my other work, for my PhD thesis, I looked at details in that kind of details in detail. But what I found interesting about that particular Cunningham work is that he kind of wrote the copy, and he put the copy in the mix of the layout. But at a time, it's also, we're looking at the 80s and 90s, so maybe by now it's something common. But he also uses the images in a certain way and juxtapose it to get the point across. So it was a complete package. There was his copy, his layout, his photograph, and it was almost the entire magazine. So it became a kind of, the criticism was written, but also was visual in a very compelling way. And it's similar to what he does now at the Times, although it's not about collections. It's more street style in the way he juxtaposes the images, I think.
And along those lines that Ricky talked about, would you go so far as to include examples of fashion itself as criticism? I'm thinking of, like, in the 80s period, you're talking about someone like Catherine Hamnet and T-shirts and so forth. They were manifesto-like.
All right.
In a way.
So the T-shirt as a kind of a media?
The statement T-shirt, yeah.
I don't know, because then it could be an interesting way. It's just also, it has to do perhaps of your first question, the way you define criticism.
Yeah.
So,
When you stop, yeah.
right, when I would be curious to see how you used it, what parameter.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Did you put everything in, or?
Not everything, but I do. I think it's interesting to include certain designed objects that are imbued with the intention of being critical. Yeah. Consider it.
Okay.
Let's take some more questions. Do you have another one there, Brittany, about education or anything?
Well, I have a quick one.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to hear what's next for fashion projects, especially since you're talking about multimedia. Wondering if you were planning on any sort of alternative to print or blog.
To be perfectly honest, we have been in the process of redesigning our website for a long time. So that's what somebody is doing for us. And I don't know. I was thinking it'd be interesting to do an anthology. So actually, quite the opposite, is going in a more traditional form. But if I were to start it again now, so I started it in 2004, I would probably do something that had to do with which perhaps if it had a print component, it also because mine, okay, it's at a print component, a blog component, but I feel like I would do it very differently and have a more multimedia aspect to it. I mean, I'm really excited about the possibility for a podcast for fashion. There's none. I mean, there's one. Okay. There's some, but so little. I feel like it's, I don't know why fashion is obligatory always going forward, but sometimes it's also a little bit behind. So.
Where's Lucy? Have you got questions? As a contributor to it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you can take one. I'm asking someone else. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you see the role of fashion bloggers who exploded in the last 2 years.
Right.
What role do you see them as either increasing the visibility of fashion criticism or adding some impetus to it?
Right. For some reason,
not that they're necessarily
yeah.
fashion critics, but
I've-
definitely writing about fashion.
Yeah. I find blogs kind of boring as a media by now, so I don't really read them anymore. I feel like there was a point in which I was really excited about it. I would read it. Now it's like, oh, I'm going to look at a video and show studio, or let's see what this magazine is doing, whereas I don't go on blogs as much. I mean, I do think the fact that there is no, it might be old school for me, but the fact that there isn't, that the really big fashion blogger, like is Brian Boy is one of them. I mean, I saw some of the, for instance, they do side project in which they, it's very enmeshed with industry, so that doesn't interest me as much because then you get a press release of them doing like a scarf or with a certain brand, and I'm like, eh. I know they're very influential, but I couldn't care less somehow. I also don't think, I think once you cross that line between advertising and editorial, then to me that's not really criticism anymore. It's something else. It's valid. It's valid, but it's not, I'm not interested in it.
I have a question. Do you think trend forecasting and trend forecasting agencies are still relevant resources to use for design?
I have no idea. What do you think?
I'm thinking more and more designers are trusting their impulses, personal impulses, and they do everything to stay relevant. They follow art, they travel a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they're using those more than trends. And
All right.
I was just wondering how you feel about them. Or is that more for the bridge market or the messy market, and the designers who really determine the trend are no longer using them?
I don't know. Somebody who worked in trend forecasting told me that according to him, because of the internet, everything is available so fast. Trend forecasting is becoming less relevant. But I never used trend forecasting or worked in it, so I have like very little authority on the matter. But it's interesting that you find that's the same way, because the person was working in it, and so for him to say it, he obviously had an inside perspective on it. Yeah.
I feel like before it used to be much easier to find legitimate sources of fashion criticism, but I'm curious about with the rise of the internet and so many fashion critics, your opinions on if it's easy to find them or how exactly to find legitimate fashion critics.
I mean, the way I structure my historical research, I still feel like I went to the titles that are known for their quality of writing. I mean, the New York Times was known for its quality of writing, from the very beginning. It was thought of as a little bit snobbish vis-a-vis other newspapers. I'm not a journalist historian, so it's been really kind of interesting for me to read and kind of spend time with the historical sources. And of course, The New Yorker has been notable in having fashion criticism from the beginning, but I think the landscape changed. But as I said, I'm perhaps more interested in what multimedia fashion criticism is doing, as opposed to just reading copy online versus reading it in print. If I were a journalist, I would have a different opinion on it. Also, I'm not making my money by writing, so I don't have that issue. Of course, writing for print publication pays, or used to pay better than writing for online publications.
And one thing I found, sort of looking at that, just to add to it slightly, is that this idea of legitimate is what's very difficult to define today. I mean, historically, design criticism in newspapers and magazines was sort of put in a frame and labelled and signalled. You are now about to approach a piece of design criticism. Get ready, I'm reading it. And then you can write your letters to the editor, and so forth. And that's how. But I think what we're encountering today, and especially the examples you've been showing us, is something much more perhaps fugitive and dispersed in an interesting way. I mean, perhaps you may think a bit differently, but just find it's not so easy for us all to say what we mean by legitimate in a way that's historically it was.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a couple more questions before we go. This is Susan.
Hi, I was curious about your editorial process. How do you decide what kind of articles and research you're going to be focusing on?
Oh, for fashion projects? It's quite simple. I come up with a theme, and then I sent. There's a few people who have come to me throughout the years. I don't know how I met them. How did we meet? We know each other through this, because the cultural side of fashion is still quite small. So I feel like you know everybody. So some people have come to me through the years. So I send out a call, and then there's a few people that I'm thinking of interviewing, but the contributors might think of something else, and the only rule is has to be a Q&A, ideally in person, but sometimes we cannot do it in person because the person is traveling or they live abroad, and obviously we don't have that kind of money. And I spend a lot of time editing it. It's really it's like I kind of don't, it's something I love and hate. I feel like, for instance, that's the difference between online writing. I do not edit it as thoroughly as I do the print issue, but because you can always go back and change it, or the fact-checking doesn't have to be as thorough, because somebody complains, you can change it. With print, you can't, which I kind of like about print, the fact that you cannot go back and change it. So the editing process takes a long time. I don't know exactly why, because also we have to somebody lays it out, and then we look at the copies. I'd never done this before, so I found it was quite a painful thing to do. And my husband has helped me because he has his own publication. He actually does a lot of the editing and the copy editing. So it's really just the two of us and then the contributors. It's a small operation. Yeah. I don't know. I have been struggling with the next team. I can't come up with anything good. Yeah. If you have any suggestion, let me know.
Hybrid shoes, I think.
Hybrid combination shoes. Obama shoes.
Yeah, there we go.
Just sort of curious, maybe a little bit related to the investor question, what your thoughts are on more stepping down as this transcript and sort of saying, instead, or
Is that what she said? Okay.
that she felt like there was no more role for it, or that fashion was
Oh.
run its course. It seemed it was a little bit veering towards that.
Huh. Yeah. Okay, this is being recorded. I felt like so. I've obviously read fashion criticism, and I felt to me it seemed like a personal decision. It seems like she was kind of I think judging from her writing, there seems to have been like it seemed to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but it wasn't there seems to be like, when people do something for too long of a time, they hit a wall. So, and there were, all these things, fashion is dead, fashion is alive. I find it kind of these, all manifests are kind of returning and on the same extreme aliyah del court. It's the same thing. Fashion is dead. Of course, it's not dead. I mean, there is a cyclicality to the manifesto and what they say. So I think it's kind of interesting. I think a lot of people complain about fashion speed. Fashion is sped up too much. Thus, we can sustain it, and that's when the idea of sustainability and fashion comes in. And there's been a complaint for a long time. And of course, Alexander McQueen died, and John Galliano spiraled down. So it's like, okay, fashion is going too fast. People are breaking down. But
Take this last question.
sure. Yes.
So sorry to have been late. I'm very sorry. I am a journalist, and I just wondered if you could say a bit more about why you think that fashion criticism hasn't attained the currency of, say, drama criticism, or even
Right.
sports commentary. Why it has tended to stay confined. I mean, you mentioned the author. You talk about a Kennedy Fraser. But look at what
Okay.
MFK Fisher was able to do with food.
Right. Food is an interesting.
Food, or the origination of wine, for example. And yet, sourcing, history, context, anthropology, you mentioned, this seems to have really been left off the table. I've been a journalist for 35 years.
Oh.
Just your thoughts about
Well,
why
it's.
it's been fragile.
I think I guess it is its history in the women's section, but as you said, at the same time, food was in the women's section. That food. Sorry? Yeah, broke out. I mean, you see a similar pattern in academia. I think at the same time, although food was in the women's section, now, we all eat food. So we all wear clothing, but I think also, I think there is that kind of history of how it was studied and how it was written about. And then I do think there is something to what Judith Thurman says. There is something in the puritanical tradition of the States. And also another issue is feminism and fashion. And not until recently, they've had a very kind of fraught relationship. And that also created this kind of sexism that Givan writes about. So the sexism is not coming from just men, it's also coming from women, in the same way that people perhaps in Washington are not going to want to be perceived as super fashionable if you are the politician running for office, as opposed to, the first lady. It's another story. So there is this way in which also there is a level of credibility. It's historically perhaps women would lose credibility if they were perceived to care about fashion or makeup too much, and that's, being broken down somewhat recently. I think there is something a little bit more specific to the States in this anti-fashion vibe. I think also perhaps because there's masculinity, like Anglo-Saxon masculinity is very different, for instance, for Italian masculinity, where being well-dressed is has been much more common, or talking about fashion for men has been much more common for a longer period of time.
Do you want to add?
Yeah. Specifically, your comment about sportscasting reminded me about the onslaught of fashion television shows that we now have. What Not to Wear, Project Runway, Joan Rivers, what's the one that Fashion Police.
Yes.
We have now all their award shows are more about the fashion than they are about the awards.
Right.
I feel like that's completely sped up our ideas of fashion criticism. How do you incorporate that in the fashion context?
Oh, I don't really. I mean,
Or how do you feel like it impacts the work that you're doing?
I'm not sure if it impacts the work that I'm doing, But for instance, the journalists interviewed, some of them were not super excited, but they saw it an important connection, celebrity culture and fashion culture coming together. Like Stefano Tonki's like, that's part of the reason fashion is relevant, because it's one with celebrity culture. And he wants to make it part of his magazine. He's like, at one talk, he said, I don't mind going down market and having Kim Kardashian on the cover. That was before she's, I don't know. So it's like, I want celebrity on my cover of W magazine because it's relevant to fashion. Whereas Robin Given said, in my point of view, that's what made fashion criticism and fashion as a subject less serious, because it made this pact with celebrity culture and what's it called, the red carpet. Of course, I'm not gonna, if you want fashion to enter the serious discourse, because as part of popular culture, you can't really dismiss celebrity culture, because you don't want to then create whole hierarchies. So I think celebrity culture is part of the reason why fashion is so prominent, I think.
Well, at this point, I'd like to invite you all to join us next door for some food, family, fashion and furnishings. Is that right? And Francesca. But before we do that, please join me once again in thanking Francesca Granata.